Good morning, everyone. I'm Brian McHugh, Director of Business Development at Eviden. With just 40 days until the DORA compliance deadline, today's discussion is critical for every financial institution's regulatory standing in 2025 and beyond. I'll start with a rather striking statistic. Non-compliance penalties could cost organizations up to $72 million per day. That's 1% of global revenue. Despite these stakes, many organizations remain in what we call a compliance confidence gap. They believe that they're DORA ready when they're not truly DORA compliant. So we have two distinguished experts with us today. Melanie Humphreys, our operational resilience expert. She brings in valuable insights from guiding multiple financial institutions through their compliance journeys. And David Perdue, our head of financial services industry. David has worked extensively with regulatory authorities to shape practical approaches to DORA compliance. Now, throughout this session, I encourage you to submit your questions through the chat feature. And let's begin with Melanie, who'll explain the crucial transition from PRA 221 to DORA's comprehensive requirements. Melanie, perhaps you could start by helping us to understand the key differences between PRA 221 and DORA, particularly regarding practical implementation.
Sure, thanks, Brian. I guess it's probably important to start with an observation from our recent client engagements. Whilst many organisations believe that their PRA 221 compliance provides adequate coverage for DORA, we're consistently finding critical gaps that need attention through that process. It might help perhaps if I illustrate with a recent example. A mid-tier bank had robust PRA 221 compliance, yet when we conducted their detailed assessment, they'd only documented about 60% of their critical ICT dependencies against DORA requirements. So the gap wasn't really in their operational capabilities. It was more in the comprehensiveness of the documentation and the granularity of their supplier management as a result. DORA introduces what I call the 3 dimensions of digital resilience that organisations must address. Firstly, the documented technology dependencies. This includes not just the direct suppliers, but also fourth-party relationships. And what we're finding is most organisations we work with discover they have somewhere in the region of 40% more critical dependencies than they'd originally estimated. Secondly, specific recovery and response capabilities for each critical service. DORA demands more than just having backup systems. It requires documented evidence that you can consistently meet those stated recovery objectives. And if that's within your own organisation or with third parties, we need to have it documented, and if it's with third parties, contractually committed to, as well as robust testing schedules that support it. And then thirdly, the detailed impact assessments that go beyond traditional business continuity planning. This includes understanding the cascading effects of the service disruptions across your entire operational landscape. So the most significant challenge we're seeing involves supplier classification and management. Many organisations are taking either an over-classification approach and therefore classifying all suppliers as critical, creating an unsustainable overhead, or the converse, which is under-classifying critical dependencies, creating compliance gaps. So what we've done as a result is developed a practical framework to address this particular challenge, which evaluates suppliers across 3 dimensions: operational dependency and time to impact, data sensitivity and access levels, and service sustainability and concentration risk. This framework has actually helped our clients reduce supplier classification effort by around 40%, whilst improving the accuracy of their DORA documentation. Remember, the goal isn't just compliance or checking the tick box, it's creating a sustainable operational resilience framework. Brian, I'll be more than happy to explore any specific aspects of this transition in more detail during our discussion section later.
Yeah, Melanie, that's lovely. Thank you. Very practical insights. Now let's turn to David for a deeper look at the technical implementation challenges that customers are facing. David?
Yeah, thank you, Brian. And following Melanie's excellent overview, I'd like to focus on the technical implementation challenges we're seeing across the financial services sector. Let me share an insightful case study. Recently, we worked with a financial services client that believed they had comprehensive documentation of their technology landscape. However, when we conducted a detailed DORA readiness assessment, we discovered that documentation covered only their primary systems. They had inadvertently overlooked numerous shadow IT implementations and legacy integrations that fell within DORA's scope. This revealed three critical technical challenges that organizations must address before the January deadline. The first concerns data location and access control documentation. Modern financial systems often span multiple cloud providers, on-premise systems, and third-party services. One organization we worked with had discovered they had customer data flowing through 47 different systems, far more than an initial estimate of 12. DORA requires explicit documentation of where this data resides and who has access to it. The second challenge centers around providing recovery capabilities. Most organizations we work with can recover their systems, but they struggle to provide documented evidence they can consistently meet their recovery time and recovery point objectives. DORA demands more than just having backup systems. It requires auditable evidence of your recovery capabilities. The third challenge involves integrating DORA's compliance into existing IT governance frameworks. This isn't simply about adding new controls, it requires a fundamental shift in how organizations approach technology risk management. To address these challenges, we've developed what we call the ROI acceleration framework. This follows a four-step process that has proven particularly effective. First, we conduct what we call a documentation archaeology exercise, mapping existing documentation from various compliance frameworks against DORA's requirements. This typically yields 50 to 70% of the required information. Second, we implement a structured gap analysis process, prioritizing based on regulatory impact and resource availability. This allows organizations to focus their efforts where they matter the most. Third, we establish automated data collection processes. One client reduced their compliance maintenance overhead by 40% through automated monitoring of their cloud service configurations. And fourth and finally, we establish governance processes to ensure ongoing compliance, including clear ownership assignments and regular review cycles. The key message is that achieving DORA compliance doesn't mean starting from scratch. It's about leveraging existing capabilities while addressing specific gaps strategically. Back to you, Brian.
Thank you both. Thank you both for those comprehensive insights. So why don't we explore some of the key aspects in more detail? Melanie, this one's for you. Many organizations are particularly concerned about managing hyperscalers and major cloud providers under DORA. What's your perspective on approaching these relationships where organizations might have limited negotiating power?
Sure, that's a really, really great question, actually. Hopefully I can help a little bit. This is definitely one of the most complex challenges under DORA. Whilst the hyperscalers and major cloud providers may be resistant to contractual modifications, organizations themselves remain responsible for ensuring compliance. So I'm going to share with you the approach that we use, and hopefully that helps guide people with some insights. We recently worked with a financial institution that had significant dependencies on 3 major cloud providers. And instead of attempting to negotiate changes to their standard terms, we helped them implement what we call controlled compliance. And it involves a few key strategies. First, leveraging existing compliance frameworks that the providers already support. Their financial services addendums often align quite closely with DORA requirements and can form the foundation of your compliance evidence. Secondly, implementing additional controls and monitoring where gaps exist. This means documenting your own mitigation strategies rather than trying to force provider changes. And finally, maintaining clear exit plans and alternative options to manage the concentration of risk. DORA explicitly requires this level of resilience planning.
That's very insightful. I was very curious about how to navigate those. So we're going through the discussion here. It's unfolding here for me, and very, very helpful. I can see how this approach would be instrumental, in helping organizations navigate through those complex supplier relationships efficiently. So, David, building on that point, just on exit planning, how are you seeing organizations practically implement this, particularly for those critical services?
Thanks, Brian. So we're seeing a shift in how organizations approach this. Rather than treating exit planning as a theoretical exercise, many leading organizations are implementing what we call continuous readiness testing. For example, a client of ours implements regular failover testing that simulates complete service loss from their primary cloud provider. This not only satisfies DORA's requirements, but also provides practical validation of the resilience capabilities. The key here is documenting these tests comprehensively. By doing this, we're helping organizations build evidence portfolios that demonstrate not just the capability to exit, but the practical ability to maintain service continuity during any business critical transition.
All right, absolutely essential. I couldn't agree more. Just to take it just a bit further, Melanie, regarding the register of information requirements, what common mistakes should organizations try and avoid in these final 40 days?
Sure. Well, the ROI is really where the rubber hits the road in terms of the hard work. To get to the completion of the ROI, there's typically been an awful lot of work done prior. But the ROI is when you can really start seeing the picture take shape in terms of the gaps that you may have, the additional information that you require. So I think one of the most common mistakes we're seeing organizations make is that they're not treating the ROI as something that's living and breathing. They're treating it as something that's a bit more static. And the problem with that is you need to begin with the end in mind with the ROI. And this is that this needs to live and breathe on an ongoing basis. So the work you do now, you need to think about the ongoing maintenance of it and not just create a one-time snapshot for compliance, because there's an awful lot of work involved, awful lot of documentation review, etc., etc. If you don't find a way of logging that and thinking about the future, it's an awful lot of effort that you're going to have to repeat every year, or more often, perhaps, if the regulator so desires. So I think one of the things we're seeing at the ground level is this is a really perfect time to think about having a contract management system or a CMS. Most organizations don't have that kind of tool today, or a lot of the ones we're working with. So they don't have a central repository where all of this information can be found or will then be positioned once the ROI is completed or through the process of completing it. There are many tools out there that can do it, but we've worked with some organizations that just put something in SharePoint, for example. And there are also some tools out there that have AI embedded, so to help with the ongoing compliance in a fairly low touch way. But this right now is a great time to think about when you are bringing on new providers moving forwards, that you embed this process from the beginning, you vet them according to DORA, you think about the contracts now, and you ensure that you have everything you need within those new supplier contracts that make them DORA ready and ROI ready. So that would be sort of setting yourself up for success moving forwards. The second mistake is the insufficient granularity in the documentation that's held. So, for example, one bank that we work with had documented their cloud services at the provider level, but missed the critical service specific DORA information that it requires. So things like individual data flows, access controls, recovery dependencies, etc. We're finding that that level of detail is definitely not anywhere in documentation, definitely not anywhere in contractual documentation. So that's definitely a second area of focus. And then the third mistake is failing to validate the accuracy of the ROI through practical testing. We recommend conducting what we call documentation reliability exercises, essentially walking through actual incident scenarios to verify that your ROI actually reflects your operational reality rather than perhaps your operational dream or vision. So the key to avoiding these mistakes is to view your ROI as a living, breathing operational tool, not just a compliance document. And it should serve as your single point of truth for understanding and managing your ICT dependencies now and in the future.
Wow, great. That's fantastic. Thank you very much. Thank you both for those valuable insights. We've unpacked quite a bit here in just 20 minutes, and I can see that we've got quite a few questions coming in from our audience. So let's now turn to the Q&A to address some of these questions. Remember, you can continue to submit your questions through the chat feature. So let's see, first one, we've got, let's start with one about supplier classifications. This is from a current customer, third-party risk manager. We've classified our critical ICT suppliers, but we're finding dependencies between them that complicate our register of information. How granular should we be in documenting these interconnections? Melanie, you mind picking this one up?
Sure, no problem. And actually, this is quite an intricate point because it's one of the more nuanced aspects of DORA compliance. What we're seeing is that interconnected dependencies often reveal hidden risks. So, for example, we recently worked with a bank that classified 2 cloud services providers as non-critical individually, but together they supported a critical payment processing function through shared APIs. This ultimately is the challenge for the client or the institution, because at the product or service level at the top there that they have, they understand what these 2 cloud services providers are delivering and the overall criticality of each one of them to the overall service. But each of those cloud services providers most likely has no awareness and definitely no real accountability at that top level. They're responsible for their element of the service. So it's quite common that the institution has a level of accountability that can't necessarily be passed down fully to the cloud services providers, for example. So I recommend documenting dependencies at 2 levels. The direct service impact and the operational integration points focus particularly on the shared infrastructure or data flows that could affect your critical services. The key is to show you understand not just individual supplier risk, but also the compound risk created by their interactions. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, absolutely perfect, Melanie. Thank you so much. The next question here is from a compliance director. It's a wealth management, popular UK-based wealth management organization. So the question is, our internal audit has identified gaps between PRA 221 evidence and DORA requirements. Given the timeline, should we focus on bridging documentation gaps or implementing new controls? David, could you pick this one up, please?
Sure, Brian. And thanks for the interesting question. So for us, this is about balancing regulatory requirements with practical implementation. So let me talk about what we found works best. An excellent first step we've found is to map the existing PRA 221 evidence against DORA's specific requirements. Following this, we find that most organisations find about 60 to 70% alignment. And for the gaps, we find it best to prioritise based on risk rather than ease of implementation. So, for instance, if you have a robust operational controls but weak documentation, focus first on evidence what you already do However, if you've identified actual control gaps, particularly around ICT risk management or incident response, those need immediate attention regardless of the documentation status. I hope that helps, Brian.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I'm sure our audience appreciates your insights on that one. The next question is from it's an operations director at a building society here in the UK. He says our hyperscaler cloud providers are resistant to modifying their standard terms for DORA compliance. So this goes back to the topic, the area that you covered earlier, Melanie. He says, what practical approaches have worked for other organizations in evidencing compliance while maintaining these critical relationships? Melanie?
Yeah, sure. Sure.
Yeah,
and this is, as I mentioned earlier, one of the most common challenges we're addressing right now with our clients. And I'd like to think that moving forwards, once the market gets a bit more used to DORA, that there is probably an easier solution to this that doesn't feel so custom. However, I guess last month we worked with a mid-sized bank facing this exact situation, but you know, it is typical of every engagement we have right now. And most organizations need to address this situation with their primary cloud providers. And the solution lies in what we call compliance through control rather through compliance through contract. And it's a little bit, I'm going to say it requires some effort. There isn't a one size fits all here. So you do have to sort of dig deep and get down to the operational level to solve this problem. But let me share a practical example rather than trying to modify the terms of AWS, Azure, GCP, etc. What we're doing is this three-layered approach. I touched on this earlier. We're trying to look at the existing financial services compliance frameworks that they're part of, and most of the hyperscalers already have robust controls that align with DORA requirements. It's often about doing the level of detail which maps and documents these and aligns them rather than requiring new terms. In some instances, there are also some changes perhaps that are required to the way services are being procured as well. As we know, in certain hyperscaler situations, the customer, for example, is responsible for firewall rule sets, for example. Perhaps in a more traditional environment, that wouldn't be the case. So when you've got this different type of racy model and who's doing what, you need to think about this at the ground level, and therefore documenting that, because not, you know, as I mentioned, one size doesn't necessarily fit all. Secondly, implementing additional monitoring and control layers where gaps exist. So, for instance, one organisation deployed their own automated monitoring solution to track data movements and access patterns across their cloud services, providing that granular evidence DORA requires. And that isn't a contractual change, that's just a practical change at the operational level. And thirdly, and perhaps I guess most importantly, maintaining comprehensive exit plans and regular testing. This includes maintaining relationships, perhaps with alternative providers, and documenting clear migration paths. It's key to demonstrate to the regulators that you understand and can manage your cloud provider dependencies, even if you can't dictate their terms. It's about your ability to control rather than just contractual modifications. I hope that sort of answers the question, Brian.
It does. It opens up more questions for me as well. So we have our DORA compliance check, and I assume that most of the larger organizations that are on the call here or listening to the replay will have had some sort of DORA assessment done by an outside agency, and they might have. We all have 40 days to DORA, but there might be gaps that they're concerned about. So our compliance check can help to our health check can help to address those. So, and I'll get into that here in just a second. But firstly, I just want to thank everyone for their participation today. I'd like to just highlight 3 critical takeaways that I've noted. First, the distinction between DORA ready and DORA compliant is critical. We've heard today many organizations have capabilities in place but lack the comprehensive documentation that DORA requires. And with only 40 days remaining, documenting your evidence is critical. Of having those controls. Secondly, supplier management requires a practical risk-based approach rather than attempting to modify every contract. Focus on understanding and documenting your critical dependencies and implementing appropriate controls where needed. It's not a blanket approach. But thirdly, sustainable compliance demands a systematic process. This isn't about just meeting the January deadline. It's about embedding operational resilience into your organization's DNA. So to support your final compliance push, we're offering all attendees on the webinar here today. And if you're watching the recording, please feel free to send us an email, and we'll get these resources out to you. So number 1, you've got access to our DORA compliance checklist. So that incorporates practical insights shared from today. We've got an implementation roadmap template. So you can use that to customize your organization's specific needs. And then most importantly, we've got an opportunity to schedule a complimentary health check to identify critical gaps in your compliance preparation. Excuse me. You'll receive, everybody on the call today, you're going to receive an email within the next 24 hours containing the links to these resources. Again, if you are watching the recording, or if you don't receive this information, please feel free to send an email to DORA@eviden.com. That's DORA at EVIDEN.com. And we'll get the information out to you or schedule that health check. Remember, while DORA compliance may seem daunting, it's ultimately about ensuring your organization's operational resilience. And at Eviden, we're committed to supporting you through this journey the entire way. We've got 40 days to go, but we can still make sure that you're on the right path come January and beyond. But thanks again, everyone, for your time today. Any immediate questions or to discuss any specific compliance needs, again, please don't hesitate to reach out to our team. But until then, have a great day, and we look forward to supporting you on your DORA compliance journey. Take care.